Okay, so we are talking about, what can I do then? Yeah, so we are talking about the stochastic shortest path MDPs. There's not too much I'm going to say other than what we already said last time. Basically, because we are essentially going to say that the value iteration that we already know for infinite horizon MDPs works also for stochastic shortest path MDPs as long as these conditions are satisfied. Okay, and the policy iteration doesn't quite work unless you start with a proper policy to begin with. And the tricky part, of course, is it's not obvious how to pick a proper policy. I mean, remember the policy iteration, we just pick any arbitrary policy and iterate it for infinite horizon one. For SSP, unless you start with a proper policy to begin with, you're not guaranteed to converge. Okay. Okay. So then I do that, and after that, we go over to reinforcement learning. That's a big thing. Okay. So this is going to get the requirement on basically rather than maximize. Okay. Now thinking in terms of class is also quite useful in as much as you can make a nice connection between stochastic shortest path MDP word and case fast threshold. In case fast threshold, we always talk about class. Okay. So it turns out in fact you see that SSP can be a value function of the SSP, the value function of the SSP can be seen essentially as the perfect heuristic. Okay. And so that's a nice connection across words. Okay, so we talked about what is the proper policy, and as long as you have a policy, and no, there's any proper policy, even if the cost infinity from every state condition does not reach both with equal to 1, then you can talk about having optimal policy. Now, notice that for you to have, for this to be satisfied, that is for every proper policy, even if the cost infinity from every state from which it does not reach the goal. Okay, for that to be satisfied, there should be two sufficient conditions. Actually, one is one condition is that there are no dead end states. Okay, notice that there is a sync state in SSP. Now, you need absorbing states, but we also say the same thing about absorbing non-goal states. Those will be the next states. So you get in that state, it's not goal, and you can't go into Okay, if that happens, essentially then this condition is violated, unless of course you end up having an infinite negative reward for that state. Since you don't actually care, since all our costs are finite, state costs are finite. Okay, but basically, so state costs are finite, and so you have a absorbing non-goal state, then this condition will be violated. So that means that you cannot have any. What the basic because if you have a single, try to ask. So as an example, actually, if I can get to that example. Yeah, so there is an SSP. So here actually we wrote, in fact, this is a nice way of writing MDPs too. Previously, I don't want you to think of MDPs as only grids, because all the examples we have seen till now are like grids, okay? But grid is not the important issue in MDPs. It's basically states and transitions between states. Right? And this is a funny looking MDP. Basically, it's non-grid, but you have all the states. In fact, I think in your homework problems, you're asked to look at a 3-state MDP, which doesn't correspond to a grid at all. Okay. So in this particular case, the question is this a stochastic? And of course, I wrote in capital letters, red letters, that it's not a stochastic shortest path MDP. So what are the reasons? Show me some violations of SSP conditions. So first of all, this is a goal state. When I put this, that means that's an absorbing goal state. Okay, so that is an absorbing goal state. What else? There is a cycle here, right? This cycle is a zero cost cycle, because of which you can keep behaving without incurring infinite costs. Okay, that's one thing. The other issue is what? S3, because once you get to S3, you don't get out. Okay, that's a dead end state. Okay, and those two, so there are no dead ends allowed and no cost free loops allowed. Okay, once those are not there, then essentially you can talk about, but the rest of it does give you an idea of how a stochastic shortest path MDP looks like. So for example, here you have an action A2 that basically with probability. So here, this is actually a nice picture to have in mind. So for example, when you do A2, with probability 0.3, you get to SG, and with probability 0.7, you get to S3. And furthermore, notice that previously we used to talk about rewards for the states. But in this model, you actually allow costs for state action state transition. Okay, so I am basically telling you that the cost of doing S2 in A2 to get to SG is 1 unit. And similarly, the cost of doing A2 in S2 to get to, this particular case, just S2 back is minus 3 units. Those are costs. Okay, I guess minus 3 unit cost means it's actually a reward in this case. Okay. Okay, so then basically what we are, in some sense, when you are looking for an optimal policy for stochastic status path MDP, that's in essence telling you the cheapest way to reach a goal. Okay, and if the actions were deterministic, that would be what A star search would find for you, the cheapest way to reach a goal from the given state. Okay, so think about this. What does H star, I mean, again, this is for those of you who remember A star, who know A star. What does H star S give you? For any state S, what is H star S? It's exactly the cost of the minimal cost path from S to the goal state. Do you see what I'm saying? From S to the goal state. And so in essence, when you find an optimal policy, in essence, you're computing H star S. I mean, when you find an optimal value function, which if you have deterministic actions and you compute an optimal value function, that is basically H star S. Which also makes you realize in some sense that H star S, so if you have actually deterministic actions and you happen to know the state from which you are starting and you know the state in which you need to go to, really you only care about the values of the states that fall on the shortest path from S init to SG. However, if you remember, the heuristics were required to be known for every possible state. Because during search, you might actually be considering other states. To figure out what the shortest path is, you need to know, which states are the ones that are going to be falling on the shortest path. Okay, so even in A star search, H was always defined for all the states. So even though you have deterministic dynamics, H was always had to be defined for all the states. So H winds up being the bridge between A star world and MDP world. Because H is sort of the value function. Okay, by the way, the other terminology, there are like multiple different models of MDP. We already saw 3 now, right? We saw finite horizon, infinite horizon, and now stochastic shortest path MDPs. And then also there are all these variations in terminologies in terms of value function V and the cost function J. Okay, in some, basically, for SSP actually, some people write the Bellman equation in terms of J star rather than in terms of V star. J star is supposed to be the cost function. So what is the minimum cost of going, minimum cost path from this place, minimum expected cost path from this state to the goal state? That's what J star is giving you. You see what I'm saying? And so J star is basically H star. But people also call J star V star. But value is typically seen to be a positive thing, not a cost. Okay, but you can use that. You can use that terminology too. So those are basically things to keep in mind because there's these variations in terminology. As long as you know that if you have a cost, Bellman equation must not be doing a max. It must be doing a mean. Right? So like the obvious, obvious reasonable thing to do. Why would I want, if I'm trying to, find the lowest expected cost path to the goal state, I should be doing the mean. rather than max. Okay. So anyway, going forward, I'm sorry. What did we do? Okay. So basically, in the case of SSPs, you are computing the expected cost of a particular policy. Okay, if you are essentially trying to find the value of a state, or the expected cost of a state, then you simulate this policy starting from this state many times, and add up the costs of the states or state transitions that you encounter, add them up, and then take the average. So it's the expected, that's basically what the V pi of ST is, and V star of ST is among all the possible policies, the policy that, if you use the optimal policy, then what would be the expected cost of the transitions. Okay, now the interesting thing to note is no gamma, no beta. No discount, right? We're not doing any discounting. In SSPs, there is no discounting at all. Okay, that's why actually it turns out that in a minute we'll see that SSPs can be shown to be subsuming both infinite horizon MDPs which do discounting and finite horizon MDPs which don't do discounting. Okay. Okay, so if you are thinking in terms of the expected cost of a state, then and as long as those conditions that we saw in the first slide hold, that means there is a proper policy, and every improper policy would be giving you infinite cost coming in state. Okay, and in that case, then you can show that there would be an optimal value function and optimal policy. In this case, value function is the optimal cost function. Okay, and then the Bellman equations are these. These are the ones that you want to keep in mind. Okay, so the Bellman equations basically are saying that V star of S is essentially, notice interesting thing. So first of all, look at this and make sure that you understand that makes sense. One cute thing, of course, is the last time you saw V star, there used to be a max, now there's a min. That's not surprising. Okay, but last time you saw V star, there used to be R and then R of S and then max. Where is the R of S? It's gone now. Where did it go? It went inside the maximization because there is no reward for the state. There is a reward or cost for state action state combination. You see what I'm saying? So that's why I put it here. Okay. So I pick an action A, and for that action A, it might get me into multiple different states when I do it from state S. So for each of the state S dash, there is a probability TSA S dash with which I'll get to S dash. That probability times, when I get to that state, I would wind up getting two kinds of cost. One is the transition cost, CSA S dash, plus the other is the long-term cost of just starting from S dash and behavior. Did you see what I'm saying? So again, this is the same equation. As long as you can start seeing these equations as basically this is not different, not that different from the other equation you had, which had RS plus max over A belonging to A of the expected value, which is what we looked at for the infinite horizon mark prediction processes, right? Okay. So this is your Bellman equation in this case. And then, of course, how do I solve this? I can do value iteration. I'll say it in a minute, but essentially you can do value iteration on this. Okay, you start with you initialize the cost for all the states, and then you take this equation and look at it as if it is an update. And when the cost function stops changing, then you have reached the optimal cost function. Okay. Actually, in fact, by the way, the words, so this is the cost function. We call this is the cost function. And I'm also trying to call this as the cost function. One way to avoid the confusion is to say this is cost to go function. Right? Basically, if you start from here and you start behaving, the expected cost you have from there, all those behaviors, okay, is going to be V star S. Okay, and once I compute the cost to go, where cost to go of a state S is connected to cost to go of the neighboring states, where the neighbors essentially are defined in terms of actions that you have available. Then the pi star is just the greedy policy corresponding to the cost to go function. Once again, if the value is a positive thing, the greedy policy would be finding the maximizing action. If the value is a negative thing, the greedy policy would be finding the minimizing action. So in SSP, obviously, you consider action A, so for every state, if I already computed a particular value function and gave it to you, okay, with respect to that value function, you're trying to figure out what is the best action to do for each state. The greedy best action to do for each state is to compute essentially the expected cost of doing any of these actions from this state and pick that action that has the lowest expected cost. Right? Just as in the greedy policy previously, we would pick the action that has the highest expected reward, highest expected cumulative reward. Here we are talking about lowest expected cumulative cost. Okay? Right? So these two are different looking, but they're basically the same structure. They're still Bellman equations, and you can use your same normal dynamic programming. Okay. Now, before I go forward, the most interesting thing is to say that if you understand SSP, then SSPs actually subsume both infinite horizon and finite horizon Markov-Daisy processes. Okay. Because of which, actually, that means any theorem that you can prove for SSP will also hold for the other two guys, but not vice versa. Right? Okay, so why, just try to think of why are SSPs, how are you going to make SSPs? So, okay, so SSP is basically an indefinite horizon MDP because you don't talk about horizon at all. And you're just blithely adding up numbers and you're still making sure that they won't go off to infinity. Okay, so now two different questions. So how do I compile finite horizon into SSP and how do I compile infinite horizon into SSP? And I'll go over this a little, but I also, if you have any questions, look at that Moussam book that I pointed out to you. They have actually again give you more details of this compilation. And one other reason to understand compilation is actually you always are busy compiling one MDP into another MDP. So understanding compilation techniques is a very useful thing. Okay. So here's the cute thing. So when I have a finite horizon MDP, how can I make it into an SSP? Here's the idea. Essentially, in the finite horizon MDP, remember the number of steps to go is, basically the total number of steps are given. And so you then start talking about number of steps to go. If you have 5 steps to go, use this part of the policy. 4 steps to go, use this part of the policy, and so on. Okay, I can convert it into a new MDP where the state space is actually the old state and the number of time steps left. So the idea then is that if you are in the same state S0 previously, in the current one, so suppose t equal to 5, then the current one will essentially say, actually I have many different S0s. S0, 0, that means being in S0 with no more steps left for me. S0, 1, S0, 2, S0, 3, and S0, 4, S0, 5. Okay, so now each state in the finite horizon MDP now becomes 5 plus 1, 6 states in the new infinite horizon, new MDP, where we don't talk about the horizon at all. Okay, so I blew up the state space. Now for this blown up state space, I will just consider the policy directly. It will be a stationary policy now. Do you see what I'm saying? So I basically push the non-stationarity, which is the horizon, into the state itself. So I'm saying being in this state with 5 steps to go is actually a different state from being in this state with 4 steps to go. Those are 2 completely different states. So in my policy, it will actually tell me, essentially, if you are in this state with 5 steps to go, actually, so now basically I can think of this as there is S00, S01, S02, S03, etc. And for each of those states, my policy is supposed to tell me what the best action is. That's basically the idea of converting finite horizon into indefinite horizon. Okay? Now, of course, you need to convince yourself that when you did this, you would still be satisfying the constraints required for the SSP. That means there will be a proper policy, and that every improper policy would incur infinite cost. This is the compilation technique, and then you need to actually prove its correctness by doing that. Okay, but I won't go into that. I'm just basically telling you. That's why we believe that you can essentially get by with SSP, because there's a way of converting finite horizon into SSP. Now, of course, there is another issue, which is finite horizon talked about rewards. We are talking about costs, but that's a minor issue, because negative of the reward is the cost. There's a third issue, which is the old finite horizon talked about R of S. We are talking about C of S A S dash. Right? But that's okay too. Basically, if I know the R of S, then for every A, for all A and S dash, C of S A S dash equal to minus R of S. Right? Because in the old model, in the finite horizon model, basically we just assume the state has a reward. If you care about that, if you want to use it that way, then just being in that state, you essentially got that particular reward. It didn't matter what action you wound up doing. Right? And it's a reward, so cost would be negative of it. And it didn't matter whether what is the A and S dash, so that's why I say for all A S dash, C S A S dash is equal to minus 1. It's just a compilation technique. I'm not necessarily saying that if you actually have a finite horizon MDP, it's better to solve it as SSP. In fact, finite horizon MDP is best solved as a finite horizon MDP. But theoretically, it's the same. Okay. The other one is actually more, interesting. The infinite horizon. Yes, sir.
Would it be minus R of S or minus R of S dash?
The way, basically, it has to be R of S, because you don't know S dash until you get there.
Okay.
And again, it's a good question. Actually, even as I was saying, I was wondering whether people had this question or not, because I had it as I was saying it. If you have to think in terms of S dash, then in the Bellman equation, R of S could not have come out of the summation. Do you understand what I'm saying? And if you understood this, then you're following what is happening in the Bellman equations, right? If it was R of S dash, then it would be inside. I don't actually mind. I mean, you can decide whichever way you want to write it. But since we said out of the box, finite horizon MDP would just write it as R of S plus sigma of, that must mean it is this way. Okay. The other cute thing is, the other interesting question is, how do I convert an infinite horizon MDP out of the box into an SSP? Now, in the case of infinite horizon MDP, so in this case, state space explosion. The compilation converts S-sized MDP into an S times T sized SSP. Right? That was what the compilation technique involved. Okay. In this particular case, in the case of infinite horizon MDP, the state space doesn't explode. What changes is you change the transitions. So the idea is, this is actually kind of a trickier thing to understand. So you need to probably think about it a little. So if the original IHDR had a beta discount factor, okay, and it turned out that it basically had state S1. Let's say if you do action A with probability 0.7, you go to S2, probability 0.3, you go to S3, let's say. Suppose that's a transition in our MDP. Okay, and you also knew that future is discounted by beta. Okay, it turns out that you can convert that into an SSP with no discount factor by essentially saying, if you are in S1, irrespective of what action you chose, you have an extra transition to goal. You can always be done. Okay, and that transition to goal happens with beta probability. And these two transitions to the goal will then work with 1 minus beta probability. You see what I'm saying? Okay, and so now if this was 0.7 and this is 0.1, then it will really become 0.7 times 1 minus beta for this, and 0.3 times 1 minus beta for this, and then plus beta will give you 1. Okay, that's the trick we play. Okay, so everybody can go to the goal state. Everybody can go to the goal state with beta probability. The moment you do that, then you have a new MDP where the number of states has not increased. You just introduce new transitions. And you can convince yourself, and it's a non-trivial convincing to be done there, that essentially when you do that, this version, so if you find an optimal policy for that, that corresponds to the optimal policy for this. Okay? Now another interesting tricky question is, I acted as if one absorbing goal state. Okay, now it actually turns out that SSPs are sort of silent on how many absorbing goal states might be present. Okay, just as A star search can have multiple goal states, remember? A star search has, can have multiple goal states, and this is actually something that a lot of people wonder when they first start thinking about A star search. Suppose I have a state S in A star search, and there is a 7-unit cost path to G1, that's a goal, and there is a 9-unit cost path to G2, that's also a goal. What is the shortest path from here to the goal state? 7. Right? Because you consider all goals to be equivalent, and you want to find the shortest path to a goal state. Okay? And the way to actually think about it, if you have multiple goal states, it's kind of tricky to kind of think, this is basically the reality. You have multiple states where you can say, I've reached the goal. Okay, but in essence, you are supposed to find the minimal cost path. So that's why when you're talking about the admissibility of a heuristic, okay, the heuristic is admissible in this particular case. Any heuristic value for s that's greater than 7 is inadmissible. Do you see what I'm saying? Even though there's another goal which you can reach at 9 units cost, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for the shortest cost path to the goal. Okay, so there's sort of a, mentally we are basically realizing that on one hand we're saying there is the goal, but there are really two different goal states, both of which are equivalent for us. And if you want to avoid this, you can actually say that if you have multiple goal states, then you can do one more compilation trick. That's true for A* search as well as it's true for us. The compilation you can do is, I would say there is a real G called G*. That's really the only goal state. Okay, and then basically there is a zero cost transition from every goal state, one-way transition from your old goal state to this G*. That's a compilation trick. If you do that, then you essentially have just one goal. Okay, so that same idea can be done here too. If there were multiple goal states, then you can always convert into single goal state by introducing a distinguished goal state and putting these transitions from any other goal state to the previous goal states to your new unique goal state. By doing that without loss of generality, you can think of essentially taking every other action and saying with probability beta, you can essentially reach the goal state, and with probability 1 minus beta, you do your normal thing. This is how you can convert IHDR into SSP. Since you can do both of these, SSPs are actually more general than either of the previous ones. I still think it's worth understanding FH and IHDR because they're conceptually much simpler to understand. But it's useful to know this. In this case, what we learned is these compilation tricks. You can convert one MDP into another MDP. This becomes pretty big deal in many cases. In fact, what looks like a non-MDP can always be converted back into an MDP. So for example, these kinds of compilation tricks can be used to take, for example, an MDP where the reward function is not Markovian. That's it. That means the reward depends on the path you took. And you can convert it into a bigger MDP where the reward function becomes Markovian. And then you can use the normal MDP solution. This becomes even more interesting when we get into POM DPs, which one day we'll get, where it turns out that in the case of POM DPs, typically what happens is that in the partial observability is about the state you are. You don't know which state you are, but you assume you know everything about your actions. It's just that you don't know. Currently, if you look around, you don't know which state you are in. You only get a partial probability distribution. We'll give you a detailed state. Now, if I were to give you a different scenario where you can always tell what state you are, but your actions are incompletely specified. That means when you do this action, there are two different probability distributions. With one probability distribution, you get to S1 with 0.7, S2 with 0.3. The action A is either S1 with 0.7, S2 with 0.3, or S5 with 0.5 and S7 with 0.5. The action is one of these. I don't know which is the real action. So I have uncertainty about the action. And this is like a different level of uncertainty. I mean, if you have, in MDPs, if you know the full probability of transition for the action, that's not considered uncertainty. You know the action model correctly. Okay, so I'm saying that knowing that the action is 0.7 to this, 0.3 to this is considered knowing the action. If on the other hand I say, I think the action A is either 0.7 to this, 0.3 to this, or 0.5 to S5 and 0.5 to S7. So there are two different models for the action. I don't know which one is the right one. If you have that, that doesn't look like an MDP at all, right? Because you're supposed to know the model of the action. But in the case of POMDP, you can convert this action uncertainty into state uncertainty by just compilation. So the bigger issue, the meta point to understand about this slide is compilation. Is something that you need to know. I mean, how to convert. I mean, there is no single way of compiling, but in general, when you can compile something that doesn't look like an MDP or doesn't look like an MD of a particular class, you can always you can try to see if you can compile it into the MDP of the class that you want. Yes.
In the assignment, you mentioned making it as general as possible because we'll be using it later. How much of this do you want for generality?
You're going to use later, for later part was reinforcement learning, which hopefully we'll get to today. And in the case of reinforcement learning, it turns out that we just basically use infinite horizon MDPs. Again, why? There is no real reason. People who worked on reinforcement learning tended to use infinite horizon MDP models as the basis for their work. In fact, one can ask, why are they even using MDPs? Why aren't they using POMDPs? Right? Because it's not necessary that you know which state you are in. And the reason is, reinforcement learning with POMDP is even harder than reinforcement learning with MDPs, which is harder than just doing MDPs when given the model. Okay? So, as that assignment question, just basically, as long as you support infinite horizon MDPs, you'll be in good shape. Okay. So anyway, as I said, of these three models, this is used a lot in reinforcement learning. This is used a lot in basically cost-based planning. If you are interested in reducing the cost and also making connections to A-star search. Okay. The interesting thing is they're all connected. You can compile one without them. Okay. So the algorithms for SSP, this is the shortest slide. Value iteration works. Okay. As long as you do minimization rather than maximization. You do the same Bellman update, but you do minimization. Value iteration is guaranteed to work. Policy iteration works if we can start with a proper policy. Otherwise, it can diverge. But then starting with a proper policy is not guaranteed. It's not an easy thing. Picking a policy, that is proper is not obvious. Okay, and so in fact, mostly people focus on the value iteration techniques. I think I mentioned this last time. Whenever you go into a new MDP, the first idea you try to figure out is how to support value iteration for it. That will always work. Okay, policy iteration is actually nicer if it works, but for that you need to make sure that sometimes you tend to have a lot more constraints. Again, this is the same question you can ask yourself, algorithms for instead of SSP when we get into POMDP, algorithms for POMDP. And are you supposed to, and basically we'll mostly focus on value iteration. Okay, one other thing again, for those of you who might remember this later on, is one other thing we will do is that, so I said this is used for reinforcement learning, this is sort of to make a connection to A-star search, then what about this program? Finite horizon MDPs. It turns out that when you are actually solving MDPs for online, so online solution of MDPs, that means you're at a particular goal, particular state, rather than figure out the optimal policy and then start executing it, you might decide to just figure out among the actions that are possible at this state, which is the best action I should do. Okay, to get that into perspective, consider the following question. You have a chessboard in front of you, right? And chessboard essentially is MDP with two agents. Okay, now you could say, what am I supposed to do? Right now it's my turn to move. What move am I supposed to do? You can answer this question by first figuring out the optimal policy for chess. One exists actually. Okay, And then just look into that optimal policy table to see what am I supposed to do, what move am I supposed to do. It turns out that if you do that, basically you die because there are 10 power 150 chess states. Okay, finding the optimal policy for a 10 power 150 chess states, basically, while it's one of these things, so basically these are sorts of things that they look like it's a solution, but it's not a computationally feasible solution. So another one is when Archimedes figured out the principle of fulcrum. Right, that basically what's fulcrum. I mean, so if you put like a big stick and then you put a weight W here, essentially you can put much less force on this side, right? Basically, based on the length of the stick on this side versus this side, you can basically put much less force. And so when he figured this out, he said, hey, I can lift universe if you just give me a sufficiently long stick and a fulcrum. In theory, that's true. In practice, exactly what are we talking about? Okay, and similarly, in terms of chess being solved by just computing the optimal policy and then using it to figure out what to do in the current state, in theory that is true. In practice, there is basically you'll never even compute the optimal policy before the universe more or less comes to an end. Okay, it's just only polynomial in 10 power 150 states, and I think the number of atoms in the universe are only 10 power 80. The last I checked. Okay. And so essentially, it's a huge number, and so you're not really going to get an optimal policy for the for the thing. So instead, what do? You don't give up. Instead, what you do is you essentially set a limited depth look ahead. That's what your min-max with limited look ahead was. And based on that, you pick the best action. When you convert what is essentially a indefinite or infinite horizon MDP into a k-step look ahead scenario, then you are essentially solving a k-horizon, finite horizon MDP. That's not what you are supposed to be solving, but that's what you decided to solve because that is actually easy to solve. So that's how finite horizon MDPs come into play. They become what you wind up using in online problem solving because you're looking a fixed depth ahead. Okay, but again, we'll get to that later. Okay, and the last thing on SSPs is SSPs and A-star search. As basically, I think I mentioned this. I'm just going to say that SSPs are identical to A-star search if you have deterministic actions and you start SSP with a specific initial state. Okay, then they basically do the same exact thing. In that particular case, optimal value function of SSP is the perfect heuristic for A-star search. Okay, and any admissible heuristic for A-star search will be a lower bound on V star. This is a very useful thing. You see what I'm saying? So if you're doing value iteration, it'll be a good idea to start with a good value function up front. Okay. One question is, can I start with an admissible value function and then start the value iteration off? Now 0, 0, 0, 0 will be an admissible value function, just as 0, 0, 0, 0 is an admissible heuristic. But a better one might be straight line distance, if it is a grid void, for example. Okay, that would be guaranteed to be a lower bound on the cost to go, optimal cost to go function for deterministic actions. Now, this insight can also be used to essentially come up with reasonable initializations for value functions, even when you have, stochastic actions. So this is basically the place where you start. You use this as the place through which you can get all your A-star insights into MDPs. Okay. Okay, and then this is what basically what I was saying. So one of the interesting things which we'll get to after reinforcement learning is over is that sometimes you decide to solve MDP by assuming away the uncertainty. Okay, now if you assume away uncertainty, you get a deterministic planning problem. Now, if you get a deterministic planning problem, again, those of you who have taken 471, you know strips planning. Strips planning essentially is, they are very efficient. I mean, worst case scenario, strips planning is also still polynomial in the number of states, are actually p-space complete in the factored representation. Okay, so it's still exponential in the factored representation. However, there are many good heuristic algorithms for strips planning. So what you could do is you could use those to solve MDPs, which is what actually we'll do when we talk about approximate solutions to MDPs in the third part of the course. In the part, not third part of the course, but the part after reinforcement. Okay, but that was you were able to do that because of this bridge between SSPs and A star search. And strips planning is basically, so SSP is connected to A star search, and if you considered factored version of A star search, then you get strips planning. Factored means state variables instead of state names. Okay, so that's what we'll wind up doing later on. Okay, so this is the summary of MDPs now. Before we'll use the next 20 minutes to start talking about reinforcement learning. So that there are many MDPs. We at least saw 3 MDPs till now, 3 different models, and they basically, some of them can be maximizing the expected cumulative reward. Sometimes they might maximize the minimize the expected cumulative cost. One other thing that actually I did not touch, even this is not enough, obviously. We looked at expected cumulative reward versus expected cumulative cost. Maximize one versus minimize the other. A different idea actually that people have considered is maximize or minimize expected average reward. This is a very different way of looking at life. Okay, now if you're considering average reward, discounting future is not needed mathematically. Do you understand what I'm saying? Remember, the whole discounting of the future was brought in infinite horizon MDPs, because otherwise large number of numbers are not going to sum to a finite value. Okay, so expectation would diverge, but expectation of the average reward doesn't have to diverge.
But then it has to be finite.
No, average reward per, basically what we mean by average reward is average reward per step. So if I use this policy, I tend to get 15 units of reward every year. If I use this other policy, I tend to get 18 units of reward every year. Okay, and so then I like this policy because it's 18 units, that's only 15 units. Now it turns out there is actually theory for how to compute optimal policies which maximize average reward. I didn't even touch it with a conversion. So if you are interested in that, essentially, the book by Puterman's book on MDPs does talk also about average reward MDPs. Okay, but there's been less work on average reward MDPs than the cumulative reward MDPs. Once again, there is no obvious reason. It's just, mathematically the average reward MDPs are even harder. There are fewer, theorems that can be that are to come by. Yes.
Ultimately, is the policy going to be different if you do?
Yes. Of course, if not, then basically, you could have just ignored discounting and just said, start thinking about average and you'll get the same policy. No, if you do different, first of all, you know that if you use different discounting factors, you get different policies. You understand that, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about, okay? And similarly, if you don't discount at all and instead focus on per step gain in the, expected gain per step, then you get a very different kind of policy. Okay. But we didn't talk about this, okay? And then we mostly looked at atomic MDPs where states are atomic, and we will look at factored MDPs later on, okay? And then we mostly till now looked at exact methods for solving MDPs. That means exact methods for value function, exact, and then which will then be inverted into the greedy policy, which will be the optimal policy. One can ask actually, since, basically if you have 10 power 150 states, let's say in your MDP, what good does it do that you have an exact method, which only takes polynomial time in 10 power 150 states for one sweep? You see what I'm saying? I mean, that little grid that you have seen, that's very misleading, because when you have even normal sized problems that we care about in for example, in planning and so on, they can have thousands, if not millions of states. And remember, I had this whole discussion about OR folks will focus a lot on reducing the number of states by very carefully modeling the problem. Whereas AI folks basically hope that, I just gave you the representation, you get to represent your problem. When you do, typically the state space will be very large. And trying to solve polynomial time, algorithms in terms of state space, and then come up with exact value function is a losing proposition. Which is why the stuff after reinforcement learning, in fact, the reinforcement learning itself, funnily enough, provides a way out. Reinforcement learning itself, funnily enough, provides a way out because sometimes if I give you the full, and this is sort of a segue into reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning, in a minute we talk, that is basically MDPs. Except you don't know the model, you don't know the reward. So you don't know the T and you don't know the R. But the end goal is the same. Eventually you want to figure out the optimal policy for this world. But you don't know the T and you don't know the R. If you know the T, you know the R, you know the optimal policy. If you approximate the T, approximate the R, then you know the optimal policy for the approximated T and R. If you keep improving your approximation, then you improve your optimal policy that you're considering. That's the basic idea of reinforcement learning. Okay, now reinforcement learning was supposed to be used when you don't have the knowledge about the world. But we'll see the reason I actually put reinforcement learning in between MDP here, reinforcement learning, and approximate MDPs. That's how I'm teaching it. The reason is that if I give you, sometimes suppose I give you, you have an exam tomorrow, right? You have an exam tomorrow, and here is this big set of papers. The whole exam basically would only cover these papers. Just read it. Okay, you have the model. You can optimize with respect to this model, but you only have a day. You want to see movies, you want to hang around with your friends, you are intellectually lazy, and you're physically also lazy, and you don't want to waste your time reading all this stuff. So you act as if I didn't give you this. The law didn't give me any information about what I'm supposed to be studying for. So let me just kind of read a couple of things here and there. That's an approximation. In fact, one way of approximating it is, here are these many papers. Okay, randomly I'll pick 4 papers. Oh, I only have 4 papers. I read these 4 papers and try to do the exam. Now, is this a bad idea? Well, if you are superhuman and you could read all these many papers in one night and not die, right, you may have done better than the guy who only read the 4 papers. But if you are reading just the first 10 pages of the first paper, whereas this other guy just picked like some random 4 papers and read like a few parts of it, this guy at least will go to the exam. And sometimes, by just ticking a few things, you might get some points. This guy might actually win in life, and you, the non-intellectually lazy guy, might die. This guy is basically is taking a model that is given and then saying, so what might say, for example, if they might say, okay, I'll pick 4 papers, I'll try to read it. I still have some more time left. Let me learn more. Let me get 2 more papers. I extended my model now. But I had the whole model in front of me before. I just acted as if I got pieces of the model and learned more and more about the model and then solved with respect to that. That is a way of handling intractable models. There are many cases where an MDP has a known model, but it is intractable. you would use reinforcement learning techniques to live. That's why I put reinforcement learning in the middle. So as we are looking at reinforcement learning techniques, actually keep that also in mind. Sometimes even if I give you the whole model, you may not want to use it. Okay. That's, I'm not going to do that. Then if I can somehow, oh, not that. What do I do? Let's see, I need to Control tab. Okay, let's try to change it. Okay. So the next we are going to look at reinforcement learning. We'll start today and then we will continue for the next few classes. And mostly what we'll be doing today is going to be just the top level view of reinforcement learning. So in the case of reinforcement learning, we still have an MDP, as I just told you, okay, which has a set of states, a set of actions, a model, a reward function. To completely specify an MDP, you need to provide all these as inputs. Okay. Reinforcement learning basically says, what if I don't have these as inputs? I only have pieces of this information. Okay. The simplest scenario is that so in fact one can actually argue, when I'm talking about removing this, so I may not know what the states are. I may not know what the actions are. I may not know what the actions do. I may not know what reward I will experience when I go into a state. That's what you were when you were born. Right? But standard reinforcement learning assumes that you know the states, you know the actions. You just don't know the model and the rewards. In the back of your head, you can start thinking about extending it also to the case where you don't also know the states and the actions. Okay, not knowing states is not particularly tricky if you know the actions. Because you do the actions, you will find out that there is such a state. Because the action will put you into the state. This is what I'm saying, okay? But right now, we'll just assume that the state space is given, the actions are given. What you don't know is this model. You don't know that you don't know that what is the probabilities with which action will take you to different states, and you certainly don't. And you also don't know what is the reward that you would experience when you do an action A and get into a state as such. Okay. And now what is the so this is basically a setting. What's the objective? Same. The objective is the same. Do the optimal thing. It's like that Spike Lee movie. Do the right thing. That's always the objective. Okay. Irrespective of whether you're given full model or no model, you still want to do the right thing. You still want to do the optimal thing in every state that you will encounter. That's what reinforcement learning wants to do. So we are still looking for actually the optimal policy pi star S. Okay, and as I said, the twist of course is we don't know TRR. Of course, you can also throw in not knowing S and not knowing A. Okay, but we won't do it right now. Okay. Now, why is this interesting? Of course, you should be able to see that that's the case. You know, when you come into this world, you don't have the full model. You know, like you have these various limbs, and these limbs will let you do all sorts of funny things. The first action you figure out is putting everything in your mouth, and if that didn't kill you because you ate some arsenic, then you will figure out, you know, plonking your head on something, various different things, And if that doesn't kill you, then you figure out some more things and so on and so forth. That's what reinforcement learning is about, right? And the reinforcement of the reinforcement learning is if after sort of putting your hand on the stove, you put it again tomorrow and day after, then you'd be called whatever challenged, mentally challenged. Okay, basically your CPU is not working well anymore. Okay, I mean in the beginning it's very reasonable. I mean it's a nice looking red looking thing. Last time you saw the red thing, there was a candy, you put it in your mouth. Now this is a bigger red thing, so you pick it up. But it doesn't seem to be good. It's giving you pain. Now, by the way, the interesting question is not only, so one of the interesting things is that when the reinforcement learning assumes, first of all, in this model, we are assuming that once you get to a state, you still know what state you are in. That's fully observable world. But that's not also true, actually speaking. In a normal scenario, it may be fully, partially observable world. And second thing that reinforcement learning assumes in this model is when you experience a reward, when you get to that state, you will experience the reward. So you know exactly how much reward you got. Again, that's not a non-trivial assumption. What if how do humans get rewards? I mean, we're talking about programs where the reward is 15 units or 95 units. These are just numbers. But how do we experience rewards basically because of our biological circuitry. Everything ultimately has to flow into dopamine. Right? So if you do something and you sort of start feeling good, that's a reward. Right? Okay? And what if your ability to feel the reward has been compromised? This is like psychiatry all over again. When you go to your shrink, then you say, Doc, I just don't feel any joy in my life. Well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's not I'm not saying it's not a bad thing, it's very bad thing. But that's not a trivial thing. I mean, people do sometimes stop feeling joy. So how are they going to do reinforcement learning? If you can't feel pain or joy, then how can you get optimal policy? You see what I'm saying? If you have a kid who basically, whatever reason, has diabetes or something, and can't actually feel pain. I mean, there are people whose pain has been so completely compromised that I had a doctor, we had a family doctor who basically, because of his diabetes, his entire lower leg doesn't feel pain. And most of you probably realize that while we hate pain when it happens, if the pain stops happening, we die. Why? Because that's the only way we know that parts of our body are still intact. Okay, this poor guy basically, dropped the syringe and walked on the syringe, and basically, he got a big wound. He never realized it. He was just walking around for the half of the day, and basically there was like blood everywhere. Eventually, that went into gangrene, and that's how he passed away. Okay, so obviously you cannot actually, if you don't actually feel the reward, then you're in big trouble. And talking about humans, actually, we also figured out, we are so smart that we realized that instead of actually doing well in the exam and getting a dopamine rush, instead of doing something nice to somebody and getting a dopamine rush, we can buy crack and get the dopamine rush. Right? I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things. It's like, imagine what's going to happen to your robot when it starts buying crack. Right? You don't do that. When you don't do the right thing, it's going to be bad for you. 15 units of cost for you. But then the robot has this funny, silly, smug grin on its face. It's been getting, different way of reward experience. Okay, the moment we start, previously the rewards were given by the world, you just didn't know. Previously, the action outcomes were given by the world, you did. And in MDP's case, rewards were given by the world, action outcomes were given by the world, but you happen to know both of them upfront. In this normal reinforcement learning, they are still given by the world, you don't know what they are. And in the human scenarios, we can actually start deluding ourselves. We can actually make our own reward. Okay, let's not even get into that. Okay, so you should be able to see the point of this whole thing is that you should be able to see that there's a lot of reason to care about reinforcement learning. There are many scenarios where you don't know the model and you don't know the rewards that you will experience when you get to that state. Okay. Now, one of the things that we'll actually find is that basically, so one of the interesting questions is that the way the reinforcement learning tries to handle the situation is because you get to execute in the world. Even if you don't know what reward you will get in a particular state, if you happen to visit that state and you got the reward, you can remember that. That's what the memory is for. And then you will slowly construct the model. Okay, now one interesting question with respect to reinforcement learning, it turns out, and this is actually something that we'll talk about next week, next class, because those are some of the dimensions of the reinforcement learning, is if you don't know exactly how are you going to learn. Reinforcement learning assumes if you don't know, the way you learn is by executing in the world. Now, if you're executing in the world, and the world is not ergodic, that means really, really bad things can happen to you. Then, basically, if you're trying to prove a theorem that through reinforcement learning, eventually you will reach the optimal policy, if you remember what happened to you in the past. But if one of the things that happened to you in the past is you died, then obviously all theorems are lost because you're dead. How can you reach optimal policy? So the minimum requirement for any reinforcement learning to actually work, even asymptotically, is that the world is ergodic. If you're executing the actions, then you never die. Bad things can happen to you, but you should not die. Which means the world is ergodic. That means you can always reach any state from any state you can reach any other state with non-zero probability. Okay, now in general, you should be very worried about executing things in the world. Although reinforcement learning is what you would do when you are the only agent, thrust into a new world that you haven't figured out how to deal with. Okay? If there is a way you can avoid execution, you should avoid execution. An interesting way reinforcement learning agents would do can avoid execution is the simulation, or is by just asking. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, so kids basically in the beginning start putting their hands on every funny thing. But then after a while, once they figure out language, they start asking their parents. So exactly what sort of bad things can happen to me if I skip school for about say 3 months? And then the parent will then tell them approximately. And to the extent they believe the parent, then they have figured out the reward as to what will happen after those 3 months. Do you understand what I'm saying? So they are using the parents as a simulator. Okay? And what about these pilots? They're trying to figure out how to fly the plane. Right? They can use reinforcement learning. Right? And seeing the many accidents for very costly planes in the recent past, apparently they are actually doing that. Okay? But mostly what do pilots do? Before they touch the real plane, they're made to deal with a simulator, a flight simulator. And in fact, I think the flight simulators on your cell phones these days are better than the flight simulators the pilots used to have 20 years back. So the simulators are becoming more and more realistic. And so you try to do all your thing on the simulator. When you die, it's just you restart. Right? So that is basically a great example of reinforcement learning. In fact, one picture which I don't know whether I have it I don't have it in this case, is one of, I'll send you a link to it. One of the famous examples of reinforcement learning in action is Andrew Ng's inverted helicopter flight. He basically figured out, how to fly a helicopter, how to fly a model helicopter inverted way. It requires doing all sorts of actions just the right way so that you won't fall off from the sky. I did this from reinforcement learning. But how did he do the reinforcement learning? He had an approximate simulator of helicopter flight. Using that, he computed the optimal policy or close to optimal policy, and then you execute it.
Did he do it in real life?
What?
Did he do it in real life?
When he in the end, of course. I mean, so if I'm a smart pilot, I will say, yeah, of course. After the simulator training, I will still want to fly flight simulation ones. Okay, that way I'll never get into real accidents. But eventually, pilots have to fly real planes, right? And similarly, this guy actually had to fly his inverted helicopter in real life. So there are videos taken of his helicopter flight. One very cute thing that we will talk about next time, I mean, unfortunately, is actually this, which is whether you have access to simulator for your work. And if you have an access to simulator, then reinforcement learning becomes more feasible. And one connected to this is this issue, model-based versus model-free. Remember, what reinforcement learning wants to do is to do the right thing. Now, if I know that T and R in the MDP, I can then do the right thing. Okay? So that makes it sound as if to do reinforcement learning, I need to first learn T and the R, and then use my MDP methods to figure out the pi star. Okay? How many of you know swimming? How many of you know bicycling? How many of you know walking? Okay? Do you know the model of your walking? As I'm walking, when I do this kind of an action, do I actually reason with the model that with 0.7 probability I will stay upright, 0.3 probability I will fall off? What's here in swimming, when I do this complicated action, with this much probability I will go forward, this much probability I will become disoriented and so on. And what's yet bicycling? So think about what you're doing in the bicycling or swimming, or even walking, you fall down. And yet we learned how to do swimming, walking, and bicycling. How did we do it? We skipped the model. Do you see what I'm saying? We skipped the model. Nobody who knows swimming knows the model of swimming. You just figure out what's the right action to do it at the right time. That's a reinforcement learning. Okay? And that's called model-free reinforcement learning. If you just go from the problem to the policy without going through the model, then it's just model-free reinforcement learning. The tricky part is if I were to ask you, okay, if you were swimming and you do this, and then this, and then do this, exactly what happens to you? All of you said you know swimming. Tell me exactly what happens. The only way you will figure it out is jump into the pool and do those three things and see what happens. You lose the ability to simulate the future mentally when you don't have the model. You understand what I'm saying? So I've said two things. One is, why do I care about models? Sometimes I go directly from the problem to how to solve the problem. That looks as if model is wasted. And if model is wasted, lots of people will be unhappy. I particularly will be unhappy because I do planning. And planning is about using the model to simulate the world mentally. When you lose the model, you lose the ability to simulate the world mentally. You just have to do it. Okay? But yet, sometimes that's the best you can do. Something like swimming, it's better for you to just learn swimming in a model-free way than model-based way. So when we talk about reinforcement learning, we talk about both model-based, model-free, and model-based. Come back next time.
There was a model made for walking because humanoid robots do walk. There was a lot of testing for it and everything.
No, one of the